Thank you for joining I Am Possible, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Glen Weyl, who's Microsoft's Office of the Chief Technology Officer, political economist, and social technologist, where he advises Microsoft's senior leaders on macroeconomics, geopolitics, and the future of technology. He is also the founder and chair of RadicalxChange and has co-authored Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism, Democracy for a Just Society. So Glen, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. Really honored to have you on the show.
My pleasure to be here, Eddie.
Why don't we start with a brief introduction? And when you mentioned that you advise Microsoft on macroeconomics, geopolitics, and future technology, could you kind of elaborate on what exactly you bring on board to Microsoft?
Well, I think that what's distinctive about the perspective that I bring is that most people in the office of the CTO, most people thinking about our technology strategy, come from primarily a technology background. And I have a long history in the tech industry. I both grew up in Silicon Valley. My parents were tech CEOs, et cetera. And I've been working for years on issues around the economics of technology. But my basic perspective, my core perspective, is one of social science, economics, political science, et cetera. So I try to bring a perspective on what's going on within geopolitics and the macroeconomy to bear on where technology is likely to go.
Right. So could you kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on what are the implementations or ideas that you have brought on board onto Microsoft?
Well, I can't talk about specifically the ways in which I've influenced any Microsoft decisions, but I can tell you about the things that I'm interested in and some of the ways that they intersect with Microsoft. So, I work very closely with Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan, who is pioneering, I think, the most exciting digital ecosystem in the world, which is really showing how democracy can embrace digital technology to accelerate the progress of technology and its integration with democratic institutions. And I think that's much more exciting than many of the purely private sector driven technology ecosystems in the West and in China, the more heavily state-directed way. Instead, it involves the civil sector integrating with the private sector, integrating with the government, and harnessing decentralized democratic participation. And I'm writing a book with Audrey Tang. And, that's a perspective on the development of technology where it's about the social context and the way that it integrates with participation and new imagination of political institutions that is not sort of the most natural one for everyone at Microsoft. And that's a perspective that I try to bring to thinking about where technology might be going. Sure.
Share your perspective on what's happening today. Because of COVID, obviously everybody is disrupted, and then there's this huge technological explosion which we are seeing. There's crazy things happening. The Metaverse, Web 3.0, and the exponential growth of technology, and I also see there's this new breed of entrepreneurs who are actually trying to work on correcting the wrong. So
I think that there's broadly two directions for the future of technology that have captured the imagination of a lot of the public. One is artificial intelligence. The other is sort of a lot of the stuff around crypto and metaverse. And the first one is to a large extent about we're going to build these machines that are going to do everything better than people. We're going to replace people, and we're going to have something that's better than human beings, that's more objective, that's more correct, that's more the true, vision, right? The second is kind of, in some ways, a polar opposite of that. That's the metaverse Web3, which is all these institutions, all these centralized things, all this top-down. We're going to eliminate that, and we're going to replace it with this, decentralized, ultra-individualistic, vision where there's no need for collective organization. Everything is just done by code and the sovereign individual. And I think both of those are wrong and confused. And what we're trying to do is show that not just the best future, but even the best technologies of the past depended on a very different view. And that's what we call plurality. This is one where rather than technology replacing people or replacing institutions, it ties them together more tightly and enables cooperation that was never possible at scales that were never possible between people who were never possible. That's the vision that underlay the original internet network of networks. That's the vision that underlay the personal computer. And that's the vision, I believe, that is the most compelling one for the future of technology. We don't need to replace people. We don't need to replace social institutions. We need to strengthen them and their connections and allow more such connections to exist by building technologies that facilitate people cooperating across the differences that they have, acknowledging those differences, celebrating them, and allowing us to cooperate across them.
When you're talking about plurality and future of technology, you are saying plurality, it's a complete different path. Would you like to maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll give you some examples. And by the way, it can harness some of the technologies from the other paradigms. It's just thinking about things in a different way. So like, the usual way to think about AI is that it's coming up with some machine that replaces people. But the actual technologies that do that are these neural networks. And those neural networks actually represent the relationship between different thinking. So like a neural network is a bunch of neurons that are connected to each other, and each of them process some inputs and gives some outputs. Now, you put a box around that whole network and you call it artificial intelligence, but an alternative way to think about it is that each one of those nodes could be a cluster of people who makes thinking and decisions, and that it describes actually the relationship among people, the way that they, like among businesses and the way that they think and so forth. That's a way to harness thinking about neural networks that's much more in the spirit of plurality, actually facilitating that collaboration. And Web3, the usual perspective is that everything's a financial asset. Everyone is anonymous, and everything is just about financial transactions between anonymous wallets, speculating on whatever. But you can do other things with that technology. You can use it to represent people's relationship to each other and democratic governance and community building and social relationships and so forth. And if you do that, then Web3 can become a foundation for cooperation and not just pure financial speculation. So I think both of the technologies of those other approaches can help support this plurality vision. But the plurality vision, I believe, is much more powerful and much more important than either replacing people or institutions. I can give you a few examples. So in Taiwan, they've built a participatory democratic platform that has more than a quarter of the nation's population as monthly active users. And this platform facilitates deliberative democratic conversations about some of the most important issues and policy of the day across thousands or even millions of people by using statistical methods and interesting voting designs that have come out of the Web3 world to help people reach consensus and come up with creative solutions to public problems. So that's an example of using technology to facilitate cooperation across difference rather than to replace people or to do away with democratic institutions and just allow individuals to do things.
You have co-authored Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Would you like to talk about that book?
Yeah, so that book is part of the intellectual journey of thinking about how we can imagine very different kinds of social institutions. And in particular, it proposes an alternative to private property and an alternative to standard democratic systems that actually achieve a lot of the goals that those systems are meant to achieve much more efficiently by combining elements of sort of collective control with elements of markets. So the private property idea is that rather than people owning things absolutely and having unlimited right to do with them whatever they want, that they would have to post a price at which they'd be willing to sell that thing and pay a tax on that price. But they have to sell to anyone who wants to purchase at that price. So that's a way to force them to put a true valuation on the thing and to pay a wealth tax based on that. And the thing that's powerful about it is that unlike most taxes which slow down the economy, this actually accelerates it because it makes it very hard for people to hold on to assets that they're not using because they can be turned over to more productive uses at any time. So it's a way where we can actually have common ownership of assets and high wealth taxes, but in the process, actually make the economy more dynamic. Another example is quadratic voting, where people, rather than just having one vote on every issue, get a pool of vote credits that they can use across different issues. And the amount of influence that they get on any issue is based on how many credits they put on that issue, like in favor or against a particular candidate. But the more credits you put, the less it buys you, the less additional influence each unit buys you. And so that stops a few people or extremists from dominating the issue. And it instead reveals exactly how important each thing is to everyone. And so you get the greatest good for the greatest number rather than just the tyranny of the majority. So those are a couple of examples of ways in which we can reconceptualize our social institutions and more effectively combine the ideas of markets and the ideas of democracy.
Would you like to share the sneak peek of the book with Audrey?
Yeah, well, so the key idea in the book with Audrey is that we're trying to develop this paradigm of plurality, which is how do we build technologies that facilitate people cooperating across social differences? And it's going to tell a lot of the story of what they've been able to achieve in Taiwan, how Taiwan has become arguably the most technologically sophisticated society and the one that offers the broadest opportunities to a wide range of citizens, and has been able to most effectively deal with COVID and most effectively deal with misinformation by using technologies that facilitate cooperation across social differences, by using these technologies that allow us to deliberate on topics as thousands or even millions of people, as a society that harnesses things like virtual reality and the metaverse, not to give people an escape to a different world, but instead to allow people to see the world through other people's experiences so that we can bridge the differences between them. That harnesses things like statistical techniques that are usually associated with artificial intelligence, but not to build the one great artificial general intelligence, but rather to allow communities to build services for themselves so that they have leverage in negotiating with broader companies or the government, et cetera.
Your views on India as a nation, the politicians, and is there anything that you would suggest or advise so that we can grow for the economy, innovation, and job growth?
I think there's a long tradition in Indian history, going back to Mahatma Gandhi, that emphasizes the importance of subsidiarity, of the empowerment of local communities to determine their own fate. And I think that has a very strong resonance in Indian civil society that connects to these ideas that Audrey Tang is developing. And for that reason, I hope that there's the possibility of building these types of bottom-up data collaborative structures, especially in such a diverse society with people with so many different ethnic and religious backgrounds, finding technologies that can understand, empower, and also bridge across those social differences, can account for the conflicts that arise and overcome them, is going to be critically important. So I think in that sense, India is a wonderful test bed for these possibilities.
Today, I think each nation is closing themselves rather than opening up, with all these hyper, connectivity and the growth of technology. I see more of these nations closing down borders. Do you see that enabling a world which is more collaborative and open, and what you're talking about, where everybody will be able to benefit the power and access technology?
Well, I don't think, in my mind, the key issue is eliminating borders or distinctions across people. I'm not that sort of homogenizing one worlder. Instead, I think we need to, this is what the principle of subsidiarity is all about. We need to actually empower those communities to determine their own fate, and at the same time, give incentives, give reasons for them to cooperate with people who are different from them. So I think, one approach is to say, let's wipe away all the differences between people and let's just have the brotherhood of man. Another approach is to say, no, let's acknowledge all the differences across people and actively compensate for those as we build institutions that bridge across those differences. And to me, that is the much more attractive approach. That's what plurality, which is the title of the book with Audrey, is all about. It's about acknowledging and even celebrating differences and empowering those communities to govern internally, but also facilitating cooperation across those differences, and through that cooperation, the creation of new communities that will branch off from it. So for example, Audrey left Taiwan in her early teenage years because she was a boy with only about 25% of the testosterone that she was supposed to have at that age. And she didn't find a community in Taiwan, so she went to Silicon Valley, where she fell into other people who were dealing with the same issues. That was a powerful thing that the internet enabled. But at the same time, Audrey didn't abandon Taiwan. In fact, she returned to Taiwan in order to build that community that she grew up in into something more exciting and dynamic. So that constant strengthening of and creation of new communities, to me, is what we want, rather than the wiping away of differences between people.
Right, fair enough. And I think as a world, we are more accepting towards our differences now than earlier. You are also the founder of RadicalxChange. What's the vision and mission of the organization?
RadicalxChange's mission is to get us to a point in our world where we can imagine as radical evolutions in the way that we organize ourselves, in our politics and in our government, as we do in our technologies. Because we think that if we don't have our social organization keep pace with the change in our technologies, that we'll end up destroying ourselves. Albert Einstein once said that if there had been as much of an advance in the organizing power of mankind as there had been in our tools, we would all have happy and carefree lives, but that as it is, we've put razor blades in the hands of 3-year-old children. And we're trying to undo that imbalance. We're trying to enable our society to advance and innovate in our social organization as much as we do in the physical tools available.
As an economist, what are your views on capitalism? Because there are a lot of people saying that capitalism breeds inequality.
Well, I think capitalism is given credit for, I think, far too much. I don't think the systems that have ever produced the greatest prosperity have ever been an unfettered version of capitalism. In fact, they've involved a rich variety of democratic institutions that intersect with the institutions of capitalism. And I think that capitalism as a pure form, system that we think of is not the solution to the problem of how do we have a prosperous society. It's just one step in a chain of thinking. And there's far more that we can imagine building off of the ideas that inspired capitalism, but that would enable far faster economic growth, far more sustainable relationship to our environment, far more creative ways of relating to each other. So I'm not a smash capitalism type, because I don't think that you productively move beyond systems by just destroying the existing systems any more than you build the next generation of technology by just smashing the smartphone. But on the other hand, I think the notion that capitalism is sort of the final point that we're going to arrive to is deeply mistaken. And I think there's much more creative systems that we can arrive at.
Last year, Deloitte had created a survey, and the survey said that cryptocurrency is going to make way throw away fiat currency and cryptocurrency is going to replace fiat currency. Do you see that someday blockchain could replace capitalism or possibly enable it to be more inclusive and equal?
So first of all, cryptocurrencies and NFTs are already a pretty significant market. And I think that digital representations of value are absolutely going to be central to the future. I don't think that a world primarily built around tradable financial assets, as NFTs and cryptocurrencies currently are today, can be the foundation for a meaningful digital universe, because the human relationships and human beings are the foundation of value. All that money and financial assets are is a shorthand representation of that underlying value. If you look at the value of the biggest companies in the world, it's all based not on even the physical capital that they own, but on the human capital and the relationships inside those companies. And if we don't have ways to represent those things, which are not purely financial assets, then all the financial assets in the world won't be worth anything, because they're ultimately grounded in those relationships. So I believe that cryptocurrencies and financial digital assets probably have some role to play, but I think that a world primarily built on those and not seeing all the relationships that are the fundamental source of value, not able to formalize that, won't be able to accomplish very much.
Would you like to share what you're working on currently?
So one thing that I've been working on that I'm about to release a paper on is this idea that Vitalik Buterin proposed, and that has lots of history and in other things in the Web3 community, about soulbound tokens. These are tokens that, unlike NFTs, can't be transferred. So NFTs represent some specific property, but they're always saleable, transferable. These actually are connected to a particular wallet or person, and they represent statements or relationships between people. So for example, if you think about the Grameen Bank, the way that it did funding was not based on collateralized assets. It was based on social relationships that people have. So you can imagine a digital world where people share these tokens as representations of the relationships between them, and that the way that you do lending is actually through these communities of people lending to each other and promising to pay back if someone else doesn't, right? And you can imagine a digital way of doing that across the world, across borders, through these communities that get created. Or you can imagine artists that when they issue NFTs can put into their wallet something that says that this NFT is a limited edition. So right now they post that on Twitter. That's how they give value to the NFT. But if they could actually put that in their wallet, then there would be within Web3 a way of representing them, staking their reputation and their career on the uniqueness of the thing that they were selling. I think that this is really, to me, the future of where things like Web3 are going, where we actually have these representations of relationships and not just representations of transactions. I think that's how we build the technological substrate for a pluralistic world.
Can you share your thoughts on Metaverse, and how do you see it benefiting everyone?
You know, like a lot of people think that crypto will be the basis for a lot of the Metaverse because it will represent the assets that people hold in the Metaverse. But the problem is that assets are a part of life, but they're not the main part of life. The main thing that exists in the world is people and the relationships that they have. And then they use money to keep track of various elements of those. But those are the more fundamental things. And currently crypto can't represent on any of those things. An individual person can make 1 million crypto wallets, and they can trade any asset they want between them. So there's no notion of a person or of a community. All there is money and things that hold money or assets. If we want to have a rich metaverse, the substrate we need for it is not just financial assets. The substrate we need is some notion of people and their relationships to each other. And that's what I think these soulbound tokens can allow us to do, to build up people based on all the relationships that they have. That becomes you and the communities. And then there can be financial assets as a component of that. but not as like the central thing organizing everything.
You, in your bio, it reads that you've been working closely with Jason Lanier. Can you share your experience working with him, and what are your views on virtual reality, and how do you think it's going to impact society?
Well, Jaron is an amazing human being, very idiosyncratic. He has an amazing experience in the industry and a crazy life story. He has very limited formal education, and he pioneered the VR industry. He's an incredible musician. He plays all kinds of Indian instruments, among others. He plays, I think, 1,000 different instruments. And he, I think, has a very powerful and appealing vision of where technology could go, where rather than virtual reality and the metaverse being an escape, they provide ways to communicate that we haven't been able to do in the past. He talks about post-symbolic communication, where actually what virtual reality allows us to do is remove the constraints that speech and writing have imposed on us, because we imagine and feel so much more than we can communicate in words. And eventually, movies started to move us beyond that. But he imagines that one day virtual reality will move us even farther beyond that. And virtual reality can also be used, for example, to imagine different designs of space that are more inclusive and that allow more people to participate in a more meaningful way. And we can experiment with those the same way that the word processor let us experiment with writing. That's, to me, the exciting power of virtual reality, is the ways in which it allows us to more creatively imagine the world that we live in, not as an escape from that world.
Your website quotes, "I work to imagine, build, and communicate a pluralistic future for social technology truer to the richness of our diversely shared lives." Would you like to elaborate on that?
The way I think about technology is by analogy to ecology, to rainforests. A rainforest is made of thousands of diverse species that nonetheless have a symbiotic relationship with each other, that sustain each other and make a system that's more stable and sustainable than any individual element of it is. And I think that is the image that we want for the future of technology, not the AGI image where there's like one system that's just better than everything and just replaces everything, or one that, as the crypto people would have it, that completely breaks down all structure and just has atomized individuals all relating to each other through that one structure. We want diversity, complexity, interoperation, and that we need a science of creating that. We need to build for that, not build for general intelligence or build for ultra individualism. So that's what I'm pursuing.
Right. If you had to paint a picture of what the world would look like in another 10 years, what would you have to say?
Well, my hope is that the liberal democratic countries have found that they can dramatically outcompete authoritarian regimes, not by chasing them in the race for artificial intelligence, or by going off into some crypto speculation, but instead by building ways for people to participate and shape their governments, the corporations that they buy services from, their churches and families much more dynamically. That the time that they spend on social media has become not just complaining or gossiping, but instead ways where they're actively working to reshape the world around them. They're participating in collaboration to find solutions to problems. And all that latent energy is being recycled back into a more dynamic public sector. And that we've dealt with the problem of misinformation, not through crackdowns, not through takedowns, but instead through active civic participation to see the other person's perspective and to find information that we can all come together on, where the information that gets surfaced in our news feeds is the things that brings us together with people who are different from us, rather than things that just attaches us to our phone most heavily. That virtual reality has become not an escape for us, but a way for us to reimagine how we interact in physical space so that we can achieve social justice. That's the future that I imagine.
I really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. You have some radical ideas, and I hope that the world goes towards there, because the way I see it from my end is that we are, as humans, as nations, as organizations, we are constantly in a race to compete and have an undue advantage over the other, whether it's in a form of acquiring a specific technology or economical leverage. And that's always been the way how humanity progresses, because we are blinded, we've got blinkers on, and I hope that we see the light, and somehow we collaborate and understand that this race has to be done in a way which is more collaborative and which is more human first and is beneficial for everyone, rather than a single unit or a single nation or an organization trying to hold onto the power. I hope that we reach that plurality that you're talking about, where where it's beneficial for all. I think you're trying to say something.
Well, and where we realize the ways in which other people are different from us, where we see things differently, is a source of learning and empowerment and beneficial friction that helps imagine new futures, and not a source of hatred or destruction. And I think that, again, is something that is history in India. The idea of Dharma is really like that. It's about the collision of different perspectives and the way in which that enables the creation of new things.
That's profound. And I hope we go over there. I really hope and I wish, but really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see and hear, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Eddie.